So one of the first things that you want to do when you have an English learner in your classroom is to review and become familiar with the following documents, which I will send to you via email at the beginning of a school year or also at the start of a new semester. The first one is your student's WIDA level, their language proficiency. A lot of times you'll hear me say the student is a WIDA level 2 or a WIDA level 3, and that is what I'm referring to when I'm talking about that. Secondly, the WIDA can-do descriptors. These describe what a student is able to do in English based on their level. And then lastly, the student profile, which gives information about the student that I'm aware about, that I want to share with you. For example, some students come with gaps in formal education. They may have a contact who speaks English that I'm aware of, or maybe they indicated they don't really know how to use a computer, so I put that in there for you to know as you will be working with that student. When you receive these, if you're unsure how to use them or unsure of what they mean, please just reach out to me and I will help explain them to you. When you have an English learner in your classroom, it is the expectation that all teachers should be using the can-do descriptors to plan and implement instruction. If this is something that you are unsure of how to do, again, please just reach out to me so I can help you to facilitate that with you. Secondly, providing language supports and modifications to make your instruction comprehensible for the English learner. And I just put at the bottom, PA code states that adaptations and modifications need to be used in the delivery of content instruction and assessments by all teachers based on the student's language proficiency levels. Here's just a quick look at the can-do descriptors, but you can see how they have the 4 domains of language: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And based off your student's level, you can see what they're able to do. So for example, a level 1, as far as what they're able to do in listening, they can point to or show basic parts. And then, for example, in a level 2 for listening, they can match oral descriptions. So you use these can-dos to plan your instruction and your assessments for what is appropriate based off the student's language proficiency level. You also want to get to know your students. You will want to know their native language, where they're from, what country, if they've had any gaps in education, and their background. And again, you can find this information on the learner profile or simply reach out to me and I will tell you what I know. So just some general modifications and adaptations that will help an English learner in any classroom would be preferential seating. You can have them up front with you so they're able to ask questions easily. Sitting in next to a native speaker would be beneficial. However, you don't want to rely on that student to be the information giver, so just being careful with how much you use a partner in that scenario. And you can also put them with a good student model if you don't have a native speaker in your classroom. Providing visuals, as much images that you can provide, help with comprehension. Graphic organizers help students to organize their thinking, and also for English learners, they're able to pick out the most important information. And lastly, simple language. The less that you talk, the more that they'll be able to understand. So keeping it short and clear, in addition to not using idioms or confusing terms or phrases. For example, when we say Romeo and Juliet were star-crossed lovers, that's super confusing for students because it's a phrase that they don't really understand. What is a crossing star, for example? So just keeping your terms easily comprehensible. You might want to switch up the vocabulary word that you're going to use to describe something. Just some other general accommodations for ESL students would be group work. The more that you can get them involved in talking with peers, the better. Modeling, I do, you do, we do, or I do, we do, you do. And then lastly, again, I mentioned the time that you spend talking. If you can keep it short and simple, the easier or the more comprehensible your lesson will be. One frequently asked question is, what do I do with students who don't understand the material? And my answer is, they're just like any other student. You need to find another way to provide comprehensible input. Some common explanations for learning difficulties for English learners is that perhaps they have a lack of background knowledge. We find this very often in social studies classes where they just don't have the learning that other students have had in the past. So things to prevent this would be watching a video prior to instruction, or maybe perhaps providing a summary or a list of important information that these students need to know before you start a new concept. They could also have a lack of vocabulary. We can support this by providing vocabulary lists or word banks. There's too much text, too much for them to read. You really want to identify the objectives, and if you can go back through a text and highlight the most important area, that would be beneficial. Or if there's no visual support, often that makes understanding the material very difficult for students. Again, I encourage you to reach out to me and collaborate if you have any questions about how to modify your instruction for your students. And there was a question about what to do with class worksheets, and you really should be modifying them for the student's language level. And I want you just to keep in mind that translating documents is a good resource, but translations are not always accurate, and students may not be at the reading level of whatever document that you are translating. So even if it is in the student's native language, it can still be very difficult and confusing for them to read and understand. So what I have here is just an example of how I might modify a writing assignment for a level 1 student. And you can see how I use the can-do descriptors to create my assignment. And I have provided graphic organizers, a word bank, and sentence frames, all of which help to support a language learner. So here you can see how for a level 2 student it looks a little different. Perhaps, I still provide the organizers, the word banks, but maybe I take away the sentence frames. I want to push them to try and create their own short sentences. Just a quick example for level 3. I could take away this word bank, still providing the graphic organizers to help them to organize their thinking, but I can see here for writing they can compose a short narrative, so I know that I don't need to have those sentence frames in order for them to be able to successfully complete my assignment. For a level 4, they're a little more advanced, so I'd be able to, sorry, it's changing here. So I would be able to provide them less supports, but at the same time, I want to keep in mind they are language learners, and so perhaps my expectation of the length of writing is less than it would be for a level 5 student, which you'll see here in a second. It didn't really show very well, but for a level 4, I maybe had expected them to write 1 paragraph up to 3 paragraphs, and then for a level 5, perhaps I say they are responsible for an entire 5-paragraph essay. Keeping in mind they are still language learners, so there will be some errors in comprehension and grammar. So another question I get is, how do I know if they really understand the material after I ask them and they say yes? A lot of times students will nod because they're not really sure what you're asking them, so they're just saying yes to try and appease you. But my main advice would be, don't ask, do you understand? Because a lot of times they're going to say yes. You need to check their understanding. It's just like any other student. Do you understand is not really a question that is appropriate. We want to see if they understand by some sort of informal assessment. So some ideas to check understanding would be have them complete a fill in the blank, matching, providing word banks for them, labeling, asking them to give you a verbal explanation, asking yes or no questions about the content, and or having them just explain or summarize to you using a translating app. Another question is, what do I do with assessment? The expectations for assessment are just as they are for instruction. You should be using the can-do descriptors to help you to create your assessments, and they should be modified for the language level of the student. So again, look at those can-do descriptors to help you to know what is appropriate for each student. A suggestion that I would provide is only test on key concepts and ideas and to avoid any trick questions. Is it important that they're able to tell you every little detail, or can they summarize the overall concept? You have to keep that in mind. What is the objective? And then also you may want to consider alternative assessments, such as asking them to do a project instead of a multiple choice 100-point test, giving you an oral explanation or presentation, or having them complete a diagram, just for example. Another question is, do I treat the English learner like an IEP student, and do I send them to Carly? We want to try to keep English learners with their peers as much as possible so they're able to pick up on social and academic language in their classrooms, and we don't want to isolate them. So sending them to me defeats that purpose. What I would suggest is that if there is something where you think that you need me to be there and or my advice, just reach out to me ahead of time and collaborate with me in advance so we do not have to pull them out of the classroom. After all, you are the content teacher and you are the most knowledgeable in that. So by pulling them into my classroom, I don't want them to miss anything. And then another reminder and expectation is that English learners should be actively involved in your classroom interactions, and they should be, for the most part, doing the same interactions as other students. So we don't want to give them something where they're not able to talk with their peers or keep them as collaborative partners in our classroom. Thank you very much.